Hi, it's great to be talking to you. It's strange for me because I can't see any of you and you can see me. But one of the very cool things about this is that I have a cold. I may be grabbing a tissue, but none of you is going to catch it. So that's kind of cool. Um, and Eliza, I have a question. Is there like a blue glowing thing in my eye? I'm going to hope there isn't. Uh, I'm Gail Carson Levine. I wrote Ella Enchanted, um, and the sequel to Ella Enchanted, Ogre Enchanted, is coming out in October. I've written two books for kids about writing, and though they're for kids, they're about writing, and I think they may be useful to anyone. Writing Magic and Writer to Writer. Um, adjust the screen down a bit. Is that better? Um, I see a note. Um, Let me know if that's better. Anyway, um, so I am ready for questions. Here's the question. Marquez asks, excited for this segment. My novel is a YA fantasy with multiple POVs, which is points of view. Any advice on how to navigate their different story angles in a different world? I don't know if the different world is so much of a worry. That's the world of the story, and you're going to make that clear. Um, I would say, with the multiple points of view, that it's best to introduce them early on. In other words, uh, readers' heads may spin if the switch in point of view starts on page 65. So it's helpful to the reader to get the reader quickly used to the idea that there will be multiple points of view. And I don't think it's cheating to put a chapter heading with the name of the point of view so the reader is oriented as quickly as possible. And what's most important is that the reader understands what's going on. And as long as that's true, then I think it's cool. And I think people enjoy different points of view. It's also wonderful if you can change the voice a little bit for the different points of view, which will, I think, make the reader enjoy that even more. Okay, Cynthia asks, if I'm writing a fantasy set in an actual historical time period, is there a guideline for how much of my details have to be historically correct and when I can blur the lines into fantastical details? So, if, for example, this is set in late 18th century, early 19th century France, I would say that details as much as possible should be accurate. Um, and when you veer from accuracy, you can use an afterword to explain the choices you made. I mean, obviously, this is a fantasy. So if a dragon shows up, readers will understand that departure immediately, and that's not a problem. However, one possibility is not to make it France, is to make it a, a made up place that maybe sounds Frenchish. And then you have a lot more freedom. So I wrote a Mesopotamian fantasy called Ever, and I did not set it in Sumer or in the actual Mesopotamia. I made up the names of places, but I did use a lot of historical detail. However, I felt that because I had not made it actual place, actual years that are Earth years, I felt free when the history didn't match what I needed to veer away from it. Next question. Jasmine asks, I was wondering with Ella Enchanted and the rest of the books in the series that take place in that world, did you build the world before sitting to write the book? And to what detail, or did it come about organically? It was kind of organic because I was in fairy tale land, which from all my reading, I knew pretty well. So, so I knew there were going to be fairies, and I thought about how to limit the power of the fairies and came up with small magic, which is one of my favorite things that I've ever done. Um, and then I got lost at first when I wrote it. I wrote 20 good pages and 200 pages of wandering. And it's possible that while I wandered and was lost, and the story was not advancing, and my critique group members were tearing out their hair, I was also discovering the world. But it wasn't deliberate. And in general, I am not a real deliberate writer. I get lost. I find opportunities as I go along that I exploit that take me in directions that I don't expect. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. I am not a fan, for me, of doing a whole lot of world building before I start writing. I may write a few paragraphs. That's about it. I think that's at the end of my. If people have follow-up questions, that's fine. Suzanne, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. This is my pleasure. And I also hope you're not hearing the clicking of the cough drop in my mouth. I'm squeeing over here. Cool. When you set out to write Ella Enchanted, were you nervous about the world building and additions you planned to make on the classic fairy tale? Did you already know what Ella's world would be like, or did you create it as you wrote? I did create it as I wrote. I was not very nervous. And part of not being nervous was that I was, nobody had wanted any of my stories at that point. I was rejected by the entire publishing world. And there was no reason to be nervous since I didn't think anybody would ever read the book except for a few people in my critique group. So there it is. I did read Beauty by Robin McKinley before I wrote Ella. And it was Beauty, which is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, which is more faithful to the original than I am to any of the fairy tales I've done. But I loved it. And it was that got me started. Next. If the question is not coming up, I'm not seeing a new question. Oh, Gwendolyn, here it is. What are your thoughts on creating unique animals or creatures, races? How would you do that, and how much of that should be included? I love to do that. We don't want to overload the poor reader who has a lot to get used to. But I love to do new takes on creatures that everybody has experienced in fairy tales and fantasy, and in making up creatures of my own. In my mystery, Stolen Magic, I invented Brunkas, who are smaller than humans. And I'm trying to remember, I think they're a little bit intuitive, but one of their things that they can do, which is really cool, is they shoot rainbows out of their fingertips. And the rainbows have substance and also burn. You don't want to touch one of their rainbows. And I think you can be pretty wild when you create creatures. I think you can create dragons that are as big as North America or dragons that are as tiny as a fingernail. It's all up to you. And the dragon that is as big as your fingernail can be very powerful, and the one that's as big as North America can have very little in the way of power. Leanne asks, "Hi Gail, can you share any insights on tying together the magical elements of a story with the main character arc?" I don't exactly think that way. So I often go to fairy tales for my story arc. And then I look for characters who will go in the direction of my story. So I think that may be helpful. So I've got my story, which is generally a fairy tale, but not always. And I'm looking for a main character who's going to go with the flow. So, for example, in my princess tale, the princess test, I needed a character who would feel, appear, at least get a bad night's sleep on a glorious set of mattresses and satin sheets and every luxury. And still be wakeful all night. So I needed somebody who would do that, and I came up with a character who's allergic to everything, very sensitive. And so she was able to fit in with the crazy tests that she had to take. So, like, let's think of Rumpelstiltskin, which is a story I'm thinking about a lot. And this is a girl who's in a world where straw can be spun into gold, although she can't do it, and whose father basically sells her, where the king wants her only if she can produce the gold. And so who is she? And how, since I like to give my characters agency, how can she have agency in that story? And how is that agency going to work when Rumpelstiltskin, who is the real magic maker, comes along? So that's how I would be thinking about her. Pabst asks, PD Pabst asks, "I've always written from singular point of view, but do you think multiple point of view could make it easier to flesh out character emotions, wants, and to show different views of a world that's being created?" Yeah, sure, but you don't need multiple points of view to do that. You do have other instruments available to you. You can use dialogue. For secondary characters who are not, for point of view characters, we have all their thoughts and feelings to draw on to tell the reader about directly. For secondary characters, we don't have their thoughts and feelings unless they put them into dialogue, but they can also put them into body language. So they can be revealed that way. Um, One character can know another character. The point of view character can know a secondary character well enough to be able to intuit what's going on with him or her or they. Um, so we can get it. We can get the world um, from different viewpoints. We can use letters. We can use Gazette articles. We can use monuments. We can use many other ways. Multiple points of view are fine and can be great. But sometimes they're a lot to take on, and maybe we don't want to burden ourselves with that. And I think that's fine too. I have not often used multiple points of view. I used two in my book ever. And some of my princess tales shift from in third person from point of view to point of view. But generally, I use one. Gwendolyn asks, what are your tips for writing a point of view that isn't human? Like, for example, that of a mermaid or a dwarf. Well, I love that. Actually, I just said that I did it only in Ever, but I also did it in the mysteries. And I do write from the dragon's point of view in Stolen Magic. And the dragon is an it. And it's exceedingly logical and not very emotional. So by knowing its character, I have an idea that of how it would express its point of view, which would be logical, which would downplay emotions, where you would get the emotion that my dragon is feeling by inference, by what it isn't saying, what it is drawing itself to, what it's comforting itself with. But it's not a character who would whine on the page, ever. And then, for a mermaid, for example, what's it like? I have written from the points of view of mermaids. What's it like to be in a mermaid in a watery world? Okay, Janine asks, what are your thoughts of fantasy novels where the main character already has a decent command of their powers, as opposed to finding out they were magical during the course of the story? I think that's absolutely fine. You start where the story starts. So if it starts with this character knowing what the character can do, I think we're okay. Hannah asks, do you have any world building tips for fantasy world? Well, my favorite is to make sure that you include a sense of wonder, because that's one of the things that we all go to fantasy for. The delight of rainbows coming out of characters' fingers, which when I've talked to kids about that, I have enjoyed watching their eyes widen. Samantha thanks me for doing this live Q&A. I was wondering at what point in the world building process you say to yourself, okay, that's enough, and actually stop. I've built my urban fantasy up for months now, while still outlining and drafting scenes. However, it seems that every time I settle on another pillar or rule or situation, it raises 10 more questions that need to be answered. Um, I don't do you. I am a pantser, which means that I operate by the seat of my pants. I do a very rudimentary outline, maybe a page, and then I get going, and then I answer my questions as I go along. Um, and it sounds to me like you may be getting lost in the world building. I get very bored with that. And at some, when I start thinking about world building, maybe I'll spend a week or two on it. But I get bored, and a beginning comes to me, and I'm off and running, and I forget half of what I did in my planning. So I think we operate differently, and every writer does. But so I'll tell you a tip for something that I do, though, that helps me get over being frightened. And I have my story going in one document, and I have a second document for ideas, and ideas in my free space. And if I'm feeling nervous about my story, I will write chunks of it in my ideas document. So you could start your story in your world building pages. And so, for example, this is an urban building, and supposing these skyscrapers are made of plastic. And suppose, for example, a battle breaks out on the 342nd floor, and your character has no weapon and starts ripping pieces of the building out. I would just write that scene and forget about everything else and see what happens in it. Ashlyn asks, how do you know if your story should be first or third person? I've gotten a few comments on one of mine that it might work better as first person, present tense, but others think it's fine as third. It's a really big undertaking to change it, and I'd have to be sure. Well, for me, the bad news is I have no certainty. So when I wrote Fairest, I wrote it in, I started in the point of, I started, oh God, I don't remember what point of view I started in. I think I started in the point of view of the gnome Jam, and that didn't work. But I wrote 300 pages. And then I moved it into the point of view, I made it omniscient third, and I wrote 300 pages. And I made it somebody else's point of view, and I wrote 300 pages until I finally wrote it in Aza's point of view, and that worked. But I threw out a lot of pages. It is a big undertaking. And writing, at least the way I do it, is not efficient. So I would say at least try a few pages in third person and see how it feels to you. As far as present tense or past tense, I wrote Ever. It's the only one of my books in present tense because it wasn't clear to me, and I wanted it not to be clear to anybody whether my main character would be alive at the end. I think you have to have a reason for doing present tense, but then I think it's fine. Okay, I'm lost. I'm having trouble finding the beginning of this question. Wait, maybe I can scroll up. Shanice asks, first, I loved Ella Enchanted when I was 13. It, like so many other books, made me want to become a writer. Second, I am writing a sci-fi dystopian novel set in the future featuring a black girl who has to dismantle systemic racism. I have decided to depict certain things in a futuristic manner, like what would happen if racists and white supremacists had their way. What could happen if Trump managed to dismantle the fabric of our government? What would be left with? How can one girl with all the disadvantages of her race rally others to fight back? My question, what do you think the best way to answer all of these questions would be? Should I depict it through metaphor, i.e., redlining is systemically racist? So now all the wrong kinds of minority get to live in horrible, dilapidated housing wards, while the rich, those who benefit from generational wealth, aka white people, get to live in this amazing city that stripped the wards of all resources. I'm thinking, um, I'm not sure how the redlining is metaphor because that's something that really happened and I'm sure is still happening. I know is still happening. Um, and that, but if you move redlining or make it, for example, something I think that we're going to see, um, possibly, um, that extended life is, um, or life expectancy is longer in this story for whites than for blacks. Um, that might be something where you're heading a little bit more into, if not fantasy, sci-fi. Um, so you might pick something else to work with. But I think you're on the right track in narrowing it to one thing so that by extension, the reader can see what can happen to other things to make um, to make change. I think this is a wonderful problem to tackle, and I do something semi-similar in my latest book, Lost Kingdom of Bamar, which does have a lot to do with prejudice and stereotyping. And I give my main character a seemingly impossible task. At the end, however, it's not all resolved. Heidi asks, would you suggest writing one POV at a time instead of switching back and forth in a daily writing session? No, I would say you should do whatever makes it easier for you to write. And if it's more fun for you to switch, you should switch. And if it's more fun to you to stick to one, you should stick. Elisha Giacchetti asks, what was your experience with the adaptation of Ella into a film? How did character change once there was a screenplay, actors, etc.? Well, um, there were many differences. First of all, I have to preface it all by saying I'm very glad the movie was made. I think it's a fun movie and it continues to bring kids and even non kids to the book. Um, There were character changes that I think were unfortunate because, and the one that pops out the most is Mandy, who is a much more interesting and much more competent fairy in my book than she is on the screen. Slannon, who wants to be a lawyer, that's something I never would have contemplated, but I returned to, I'm very glad it was made. Dawn asks, do you think the omniscient narrator is still being used and accepted in today's market? Well, I think you can do, as long as you get away with it, you can do anything. And I also don't think too much that we should worry about market when we're writing. I think you should just write the story that you want to write. I love omniscient point of view because it's so powerful. I wonder if you could make an argument, and I'm not sure, about the book thief and whether the book thief, even though it's a perspective of a particular character death, whether that's omniscient. So I don't know. But I think you should go for it. Heather asks, do you have tips for developing magic systems? The only tip I have is that the power needs to be limited, or there has to be other power that can make it not work so well, or we don't want our characters to be omnipotent because they can't get in trouble. So I think that thinking about magic needs to be paired with thinking about the characters who are going to use it, and how it's going to work in their favor and how also it's going to work against them, which makes it more fun. The other thing that I'm not fond of is magic that isn't concrete. So I like to be able to see and understand what's going on in my magic. It needs to be pretty solid for me. Marquez asks, do you think there are elements of fantasy that are played out, such as dragons, fairies? I hope not. If so, what do you think of creating completely new monsters and friends? Would readers enjoy such a thing? I love the traditional type of fantasy type of characters, but I don't think any. I just stopped because an email from Eliza just popped up. Are you still hearing me or not? Oh, okay, I'm fine. Um, you know, uh, I don't think any writer wants their book to be too similar to another's book. And I don't think that's likely to happen. I do writing workshops and I give prompts, and people pick the same prompts and write something entirely different. Um, but I also have a tip that to me is a explodes cliches and is an originality um, aid, and that is lists. So if you're not sure what to do next and you're worried that you're going down a track that other people have followed, write a list of what else can happen. And I say make the list 10 possibilities long, or even better, 15 possibilities long. Because when you're racking your brain and nothing seems to be coming, if you keep at it, your brain kind of cracks open and starts sending very surprising things. I'm okay. Let's see. One thing that bothers me is in a fantasy world is when characters are described as Asian or Hispanic, etc., when there's no link to Earth in the story. How do we go about describing the characters without relying on those terms? Um, I'm with you on that. So I have a lot of skin tone in my fairy tales, but I never say African or, I don't do that because there's no Earth. But I use skin tone. You could use eye shape, um, hair, but mix it up. So the person with sallow complexion, um, some of what we think of as, for example, Asian features might be mixed with other characteristics that we associate with um, African looks or um, Caucasian. Without using those terms, we can make it pretty interesting. Storyologist, cool name. I love hearing about your wanderings as you created Ella Enchanted. Can you talk a little more about your writing process? Well, I always preface this by telling about how I went to a school once, and I think I was talking about Fairest and about throwing away 900 pages before I got the point of view right. And when I got home, a few days later, I got a letter from one of the children who said, "Before you came to my school, I wanted to be a writer, but now I don't. It's too hard." So I, even for my fantasies, I tend to Google a lot. If I'm doing sword play, I'm looking at YouTube, sword instructions on wielding a sword. Um, I use my ideas folder. Um, I keep a ideas document. I keep a document of names so I can keep track of what I named characters. I try not. I try to uh, when it comes to names, not to name everybody names that start with J, for example. And there happen to be a lot of names that start with J. I keep track. I don't have a page goal for a day, but I do have a time goal. And I'm very distractible. So if I get an email, I tend to look at it, but I write down my stop time when I toggle over to my email, and I write down my start time when I get started again. And I keep track of that. And my goal is at least 2.25 hours a day, which I have not met yet today, but I hope I will be able to. If I fail to get there, I forgive myself because if I don't forgive myself, it's harder to get started the next day. So it's not an efficient process. I write a lot of notes in my ideas about where I'm going next. I do have a document that's an outline, but I tend to forget about it. And then I refer to it every so often. Hannah asks, is a story a fantasy if the creatures are given scientific explanations? It can be. Um, the science, I think that's great. Um, if it's current 21st century science, I think that's great. If you can find out ways to have a dragon, um, and I don't see why you couldn't. Um, I'm not so sure about the fire breathing. I'm not sure how you would explain that in actual science. It would be interesting to try, but it can also be fictional science. Um, but one might think about, in order to shoot fire out of your mouth, one might think about the kind of um, what the stomach and what the esophagus might be lined with. And one might look at how sword swallowers do their thing. I think that would be fun. That's a fun question. Um, Suzanne says, love Beauty, read it dozens of times. Okay, so since I don't see tons of questions, I'm going to go ahead and ask something specific. My agent has recently taken a younger middle grade fairy tale mashup out on submission. As we plan for a hoped for series, I find it difficult to balance the larger political and social movements behind the scenes that I, as the author, know, with the need to keep the story immediate and focused on my characters and audience. Um, Gee, I don't know. I think the focus should stay on, well, this is something that I would go to notes for. I would um, ask myself how the political and social movements can work their way in to the storyline so that it's part of the character's daily life, and then the audience will see it. And I don't think you need to worry about the audience. They can handle almost anything. A middle grade audience is pretty. It's different from YA, but middle grade audience can handle a lot of complexity. Shanice asks, when you wrote the princess test, how did you come up with details as small as the shape of the toes of a princess? How did you come up with the crocodile princess? Where do you find these amazingly magical but wonderfully simple details? Thank you. This is where lists come in. I write a list of what these other contestants in the Princess Tales might have been like. I don't remember the toes. I'm sorry, I don't remember that. Um, but I wrote those books very long ago. Lists. Lists are the best gift to a writer. Jennifer asks, hello, Gail. I'm squealing in excitement that you're here. Ella Enchanted was one of my favorite books when I was a kid, and Ella's gift inspired my main character's gift that also has consequences. My work in progress is a middle grade epic fantasy for the middle age group. Is there such a thing as having too many fantasy elements? The main guide is clarity. Is the reader going to be lost? If the reader is not lost, bring it on. If the reader is going to be lost, pare it down. And if you can use a critique group to help you know if you're overloading, or a beta reader, or some other eyes on the story, that will help. I just got the 5-minute warning, so I want to mention before we go that I do have a blog that's all about writing, and you can visit it on my website, which is gailcarsonlevine.com. Danica asks, how long does it take you to finish a story? Not just the first draft, but any subsequent rewrites. I would say my average for a novel is about 2 years. But depending on how lost I get. Stolen Magic took me 4.5, and I am trying very hard never to let that happen again. Um, so it depends. If it goes easily, 9 months a year. And while I'm waiting, I don't know if there's time for more. I want to thank you for great questions. Okay, I can't find. Jennifer asks, one of my work in progress takes place in an alternative universe where there are many different cultures similar to our world, European, Asian, African, etc. And my main character is a Hispanic boy who refers to his grandmother as abuela. Um, I don't have the talent to make up languages, and abuela is the only non-English word I use. Should I weave more non-English words into my manuscript when writing about different cultures, or should I not have my MC call his grandma abuela at all? What are your thoughts? I don't know if it matters, but I am multiracial and part of my heritage is Hispanic. And if this goes to an earlier question. If this world has a Spain, has a South America, has the same geography as our world, I think it's fine to use abuela. I think you can decide whether or not you want to weave in other words. I think once you introduce one, it's good to weave in more. If there is no, if the geography is entirely different, I would not use abuela. But I might um, switch the things around and make it, I might even anagram abuela to come up with a different word for grandma. And you could do that, you could have fun, and this is how I take so long to write my books. But you could have fun anagramming lots of words. Jasmine asks, I'm working on a novel now where the characters use science and engineering to defeat traditional fairy tale creatures, ogres, dragons, etc. I love how your books take these traditional creatures and bring something new to them. Do you think that the contrast of defeating these conventional monsters in non-conventional ways, engineering, brings enough freshness to the fairy tale tropes, or do I need to take it a step further and make the monsters themselves less conventional as well? I don't see why you have to do that. I'm never sure when to keep the traditional elements for familiarity, but I don't want the book to feel stale. And I these worries like the book feeling stale or repeating, or I think these are the kinds of things we should try very not hard not to worry about. We should whisper them into, I just said this on my blog, into a lead canister and drop the canister into a crevice, because they just slow us down and make it harder to write. Okay, go ahead and wrap up as soon as you're comfortable. Okay, I am comfortable and my throat is hurting anyway. So, uh, this was a lot of fun. You asked great questions. You can visit me on my guest book at my website or on the blog. I would love to see you there. Thank you very much.